Welcome to Frank Talk. This is brought to you by the Leadership Dialogue Institute. I'm Albert Dadon, your host. Today, we have a special guest, my very close friend, David Suissa. David is in Los Angeles. He is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal. He also has his own podcast, Pandemic Time. He will tell us the story in a bit. But most of all, he's a grandfather. Congratulations, David.
Thank you, Albert.
Grown grandson.
Thank you, my friend.
That's wonderful news. So, is it a civil war, or is it still within the confines of riots? How would you define what's happening in America right now?
Well, it's unlike anything we've ever seen, and that started with the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, the year 2020 is a year that's going to go down in history. When you consider that it started with the impeachment of a president, which happens once every century, and then you have the unprecedented crisis where up to over 100,000 people have died from this virus, and over 40 million have lost their livelihoods, and trillions of dollars have been poured into the economy to mitigate the disaster. And the word disaster does not overstate the case. And then right in the middle of the biggest story of the past 100 years, we have a country that's full of riots. And right now I'm in LA. Yesterday, the curfew was 8 p.m. And today we got word that the curfew is 5 p.m. So about an hour ago, if you go outside now, you may get arrested by either a policeman or a National Guard. And that's unheard of, Albert. Whether we're in a civil war or not, I think that's a long discussion. But I think for now, we need to establish that what we are going through in America is shaking us up. And it's shaking everybody. It's shaking the rabbi at the synagogue because people are afraid to go back and they don't want to pray with a mask on. It's shaking up my friend who owns a restaurant and has to keep paying bills every month, and he's forced to close, as well as a doctor friend of mine who had to close his practice. It's shaking up people who were living paycheck to paycheck, and the unemployment checks are now running out. It's shaking up people who are sitting Shiva, who are burying their family, and they can't be at the burial. And they have to have Zoom memorials. And it's really a earth-shattering earthquake that has hit American society. And I can't overstate it. And as a journalist, we've been working 24/7. We've never seen anything like it. And we just keep, trying to cover a story that is almost impossible to stay ahead of. And the other part of the story that's incredible is how global it became. A tiny virus has taken on all of humanity. And when you combine that with the social media component, where the news spreads instantly, it's really quite a lethal mix that is leaving many of us bewildered, uncertain. We don't know which world we're going into. And on top of everything, as if that's not enough, it's an election year. The most I've been living here since 81. And I've seen a lot of ugly stuff in American politics. Never like right now. The division is as intense as I've ever seen. So you have a combination of all these factors, a perfect storm that has left many of us shaken.
So, David, the George Floyd, was that the straw that broke the camel back, or what is happening now is totally disconnected with that?
Oh, I think there's a connection, Albert. First, if you look at it in two components, one, police brutality. On that level, yes, there was what's called a tipping point with the George Floyd. The actual event itself was unlike the others because it was so graphic. You have a knee on a neck for 8 minutes and 53 seconds. As bad as all the other ones were, it was never something as graphic. And you see a guy's face completely callous and a black man on the ground saying, "I can't breathe," calling for his mama who died. So the optics were as graphic and horrible as you can ever imagine. You can't even write that script. And when it happened, there was such unity across the spectrum. All of the country was united against the act. There were condemnations from every police commissioner across the country. So, yes, that was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of police brutality. Now, if you combine the restlessness of the COVID-19 quarantine and the lockdown, people were restless. And the summer is coming along. So, this thing with George Floyd hit right at the time when people were starting to come out of their homes. And a lot of these people that came out of their homes are really in bad shape financially, and they're hungry. So again, you have a perfect storm of the George Floyd incident and the situation of the COVID-19, and it's really combustible. And unfortunately, it's unraveled right now. And all the goodwill that was built up in those first 48 hours when the whole country was united against police brutality, that's all gone now. We're talking about the violence of the protesters rather than the violence of the police.
That's right. And you've got like Antifa, apparently, is one of the huge groups that is part of these riots, but not just Antifa. I hear that there are also some extreme right groups that have joined the party. I mean, it seems to be a mixed bag what's going on right now. That's why I started by saying maybe it's a civil war. I'm not sure whether you saw the tweet that Trump just did a couple of hours ago, where he's calling on people to use their Second Amendment. So, I mean, it's a blanket call for people to take action against the protesters. Did you see that?
Yes, I did. I did.
What's your
And
interpretation of that?
well, the first thing to remember is that Donald Trump is a man who enjoys confrontation. He's made a lifetime, he's made a living and a very successful career out of confrontation. He thrives on on fighting people. The reason he's had a lot of difficulty fighting the virus is because the virus is not a human being. So he's not a unifier. He's not someone, he's not a Martin Luther King or even a Barack Obama who's going to try to bring the country together. He's a fighter and a divider. And he's in it. And right now, that's what we're seeing from him. We are seeing Donald Trump. And, and he, by making these calls that you referred to, he's doing what he does, which is accentuate the divisions, and it doesn't augur well. Now, as far as who is doing the rioting, there's a lot of controversy on this, but it's pretty clear from everything we know so far that it's far than just demonstrations against one act. That there are people who thrive on chaos. You and I were talking about that earlier, even in France with les Gilets jaunes. Anytime there's chaos, it attracts a certain element, whether from the right or the left or just plain gangsters. Right now in LA, there are, the people come out at night and they're opening up the stores and they were looting the Nike stores. And there's a tremendous amount of looting that's going on that's got nothing to do with George Floyd or police violence. It
But
has to do with
David,
looters.
I'm hearing that the mayor of Los Angeles and many other mayors around the country. By the way, there's 140 cities at the last count in the United States that are under riot. So apparently, some of the mayors, and Los Angeles is one of them, who actually issued an order to the police not to actually intervene. Is that correct?
No, I think there is a history in LA because of the Rodney King riots of 1992, where they're extra careful, not because there was a real trauma in this city, and I was here. And I think the first few days of the riots, they were a little too careful. And I have friends of mine who were shocked that Rodeo Drive was not better protected, and you had looters on Rodeo Drive, and they were actually trying to barge in to that hotel that you and I spend many times on the Beverly Wilshire Hotel on Wilshire, right off Rodeo Drive, and that to call extra security to ward off the mob. So the first few days were, I agree with you that the security was not good at all. The National Guard came in the past 48 hours. I've had reporters all around the city, and I had a reporter that was with the National Guard last night. downtown as well as in Santa Monica, and they've really cracked down right now. They've arrested 1,200 people in LA in the last 48 hours. So there's really, they're taking it seriously right now. I think the feeling throughout the country right now is that law enforcement has had it, and there's a sense that they're really cracking down. Let's see what happens.
And on the other side, uh, you know, we tend to now overlook the police brutalities because the response to the police brutality has been nearly more brutal than the police. It's a little bit that's something that you learn in if you do a self-control course. You learn that if someone lashes at you, if you respond, then it's about your response, not longer about the person who lashed at you. So in this instance, the police brutality has been absolutely abominable. It has been like that for a very long time. It's hard to fathom, David, that uh, the police hasn't learned. I mean, hasn't the chief of the respective police in the United States do their recruitment process in a way that eliminates the extreme elements that tend to do that sort of things? I mean,
Well, there's a
remember
couple of,
we remember in the 60s, the 70s. I mean, this is nothing new there. And so the fundamental question is that when you've got a very strong police in any country, not just the United States, when it goes too far, then the population at some stage the society tend to destabilize. So isn't that a little bit the cause and effect? And even if the effect has gone a little bit too far, there is this cause that is not just the George Floyd, but it's a history, and it's been there. And at some point, people have to say enough. And how do you say enough, and so that the authority end up listening to you? Because
well,
the reality is nothing has ever been done in the United States for the violence, especially against the black, but not just against the black, to stop.
well, here's the complication is right now in the world of social media, any mistake is going to be blown out because in the 60s we didn't have iPhones to film and then spread all over social media around the world. So that is one thing they need to take into account, and even the policemen themselves film themselves. The other thing that's very difficult as far as police reform is the police unions are very strong in America, and there's a tendency to protect their own. So as much as they've tried to do reform, um, they haven't really accomplished it. They have in LA. There's been a major progress just because we had those riots from Rodney King. But what you're seeing now is a situation where the population is not thinking about police brutality right now. They're thinking about protecting their homes. I have friends in my neighborhood who went to buy guns, I have friends who have boarded up their stores in the valley. And this is what I find really tragic is that the reaction, what you refer to in the thing of anger management, is when the reaction supersedes the initial cause. This is what happens now. Um, the situation of police brutality is one that has been overblown, if you ask me, because there's such a component of racism in America. Racism is like an obsession in America. There is a real political interest in keeping it alive. The New York Times decided to rewrite American history with a project called 1619, so that American history doesn't start with the Constitution. It starts when they brought 12 slaves in 1619. There's a real political interest to to look at America as an oppressor country that brutalized the American Indians when they came here, and that's still a country born in sin. And that is something that is very difficult to shake. If you look at the progress in the 1960s, blacks were not allowed to go to restaurants in the South. An enormous amount of progress has been made for blacks, for gays, for women. You'll read from some black intellectuals, Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell, and many others, that have really risen up against the obsession with victimhood in America. So what you see is you don't have the leaders to make those kind of messages that you said, to control your anger. For example, Martin Luther King, that was exactly his message. He knew that if they protested with violence, they would lose the battle. He knew it. And the reason he accomplished so much success is because he was smart enough to know that to keep your enemy on the hook, you can't give him an excuse. And he didn't. And right now, there are no Martin Luther Kings that is speaking to the looters and telling them that they're losing the battle of public opinion. No one's there. So what you see is you see a conflagration that's getting worse and worse. So on the one hand, people are scared. Fear has been the dominant emotion in America since the beginning of the year. It's either fear of the virus, fear of the lockdown, and now fear of the riots. So you have fear on one side and anger and fury on the other. And right in the middle, there's a leader called Donald Trump who will not bring the two sides together.
And in the midst of all
I'm sorry if I'm not sounding too hopeful, Albert. I wish I could, talk about music and love and poetry. You know what I mean? It's like, but I'm a journalist, so I have to give it to you straight.
You're doing an absolute fine job. In the midst of all of this, of course, there is an election going on in the background. It's a year where you've got your presidential elections. And so November is not that far away. So COVID-19, the distraction of the economy, the lack of a rebound, although Wall Street has rebounded somewhat, but the rest of the society has not. How do you see the chances of Donald Trump, and how is Joe Biden doing? What are the politics in the United States right now, despite of all the riots?
Okay, well, it's a great question because the politics are very messy right now. On the one side, you have a candidate for the Democratic Party that has really lost some cognitive functions, and it's embarrassing. And I think the people on the inside, they know it. So there's a really weak candidate on the Democratic side. And on the Republican side, you got Donald Trump, who's as hated as any president in memory. And then in the middle, you have the environment of the crisis with COVID and now the riots. And on top of that, maybe the most controversial issue of all is, will people go to the polls to vote in person? Because right now, um, the Democrats would like to make it a mail-in vote elections. And when you do mail-in votes, you're really vulnerable to a lot of fraud. And that right now, that's a big debate. I don't know how that debate's going to shake out. Donald Trump is very much against a mail-in ballot campaign. So I think this is the first thing we need to keep an eye on, is how they're going to decide on that. And there is a convention for the Republicans in July, whether they're going to have it in the place where they're supposed to have it in North Carolina is an open issue, and whether Trump is going to get his rallies back. Because remember, Trump, a big part of his success is to have 20,000 people at rallies. And it's covered on the news and it's covered all over YouTube. So he's lost a big weapon of his. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is kind of hidden in his basement and they're trying to keep him away from too much press attention. So you have this really odd moment in America right now where both candidates are not at their best. And Donald Trump has not been at his best fighting the virus and fighting the riots. So what you'll see right now from all the polls that I've seen, and by the way, if you want the best polls, go to realclearpolitics.com. That's the Bible, realclearpolitics.com, as well as 528. That's Nate Silver. Those are as reliable as they get. But right now, Biden has a lead nationally, but in the states that what they call the battleground states that make the difference, Trump, according to some polls, has a small lead. Now, Biden made a big mistake with the African American community. A big part of his support is the African Americans. Um, Hillary got 92% of the black vote, and she still lost. And right now, Biden is in the mid 80s with the black vote, and he really made a blunder. He came on this very popular breakfast podcast with Charlemagne Dagod. I don't know if you heard about this,
Yeah,
and he
yeah, yeah.
said if you're not sure who to vote for, then you ain't black. That was as big a blunder as you can imagine in politics, and he still hasn't really recovered fully from that. So you have a real messy, fluid situation. Now, if the economy comes back, then that will be in my view, a decisive factor because a big part of Trump's success has been the economy. This is it's his bailiwick. It's his what do you call it? It's his calling card. And I think this is why he looks like a fish out of water right now, because for the first 3 years of his presidency, he was really cocky. He was on top of the world. The economy was roaring, lowest ever unemployment among Hispanics and African Americans. Truly an incredible accomplishment for a guy who has, horrible character problems and who lies constantly and who's vulgar and all those other character flaws. uh, you couldn't take that away from him. He really, really had this incredible economy in America, and it feels so far away from now. So he's lost that. He's lost his number one weapon. And then the question now is, will the economy come back before the election? And there's a lot of controversy on that. There's a economist Furman who used to work for Obama who thinks it's going to come roaring back, but he's in the minority because 2/3 of the American economy is based on consumption. It's based on people who spend money, and right now people are afraid. A lot of people do not want to spend money because they got spooked, so they have less money to spend. And who wants to go to a restaurant where you have to wear a mask? And who wants to go shopping in the conditions that they are right now? So there's a big concern that the number one engine of the American economy, which is consumption, is going to take such a hit that the economy won't recover until 2021.
Hmm. On the Democratic side, David, when is the Democratic Congress that will endorse Joe Biden? I hear also that there is a possibility that there might be another candidate that could come and take his place. What?
Well, there's lots of rumors on that. It looks like now like they're going. It's not clear that they're even going to have a convention. There's a tremendous amount of fear of the virus. There's a greater fear among the Democrats than among the Republicans. There are rumors about Michelle Obama coming in, and she's the most popular woman in America right now by far. And if she replaces Biden, then good luck, Donald Trump. Um, but there are lots of rumors. But to be honest with you, I can't confirm any of these rumors right now. You have to keep in mind a big factor in the Democratic Party is the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party is very big and very strong. Now, a lot of people do not know that they were the ones that put Trump over the top. They were so offended by what the establishment did to force out Bernie Sanders in favor of Hillary Clinton that a lot of them voted for Trump. They have they don't have a loyalty to the Democratic Party. Their loyalty is to Bernie and his far left wing policies. So the leaders of the Democratic Party know this, and they've been doing everything they can to keep them in the fold. But they are the X factor in on the Democratic side, and if they rebel, if they feel that their candidate Bernie has been disrespected, then you know they can put Trump over the top. Now, whether they replace, if, for example, you talk about replacing um, Biden, if they don't replace Biden by Bernie, good luck. You know, they'll need somebody like Michelle Obama. It can't be somebody else. It certainly can't be Hillary Clinton, although there's some rumors that she wanted to be in. And then the other thing is the choice of vice president. big issue. So um, the Amy Klobuchar was the leading candidate, but it turns out that she's got skeletons in her closet because she wasn't a strong enough prosecutor in Minnesota when she was the head attorney there. So that's up in the air as well. And you have everything is fluid right now. It looks like everybody is saying that Joe Biden is going to be the candidate from now because they think Trump is so vulnerable that they'll beat him. But they felt the same way about Hillary.
Um, let's talk about foreign policy for a second. So this COVID-19 has obviously uncovered a few issues with China, with the WHO. The response of Trump, we know. He has announced in the last couple of days that America is withdrawing definitely from the WHO. So you heard all of the stories about China. What does the public believe, and how big is that story in the public minds?
Oh, I think
Given all of what's going on right now, we know what's on the front of their mind. But is that playing any role at all in the forthcoming election?
I think it's going to play a very big role, Albert, very big. And from my friends inside the Republican Party, this is going to be a big part of Donald Trump's strategy is that he's stronger on China than Joe Biden. China has been caught up in a kind of backlash against globalism in America. For many, many years, especially under the Obama administration, globalism was seen as the panacea. It's like the, the arc of history. This is the way history is evolving. We're like the cosmopolitan elite. The world is flat. The world is interconnected. Everybody travels all around the world instantly, and that was seen as the natural evolution of history. But that left a lot of people behind in America. There's a decimation of the manufacturing base. Um, and people really suffered, and Donald Trump was able to tap into that. The growth of China and the threat of China fits right into that. For example, 90% of the raw ingredients that we need for our medication is made in China. They have enormous leverage over us because most of our medication is made there and on many, many other levels
Not
as
just
well.
for the United States, by the way, this is the case for the entire world. China seems to be manufacturing 80% of all medicine. I think India is the other 20%.
Right, and then you combine that with the COVID-19 controversy, where there's pretty decent evidence that they were not forthright with the WHO and that they didn't tell the world how dangerous it was. So there's really some negative vibes against China right now on many levels, and I think Trump is going to totally take advantage of that. Now, as far as like the American role in the world, look, Trump has taken America in another direction. Um, I think what you saw with George Bush when he went into Iraq, there was another America, an America that was so proud of its values of freedom and liberty that they thought that they could go into any place around the world, and they really took a beating. And Americans were traumatized by the defeat in Iraq. I had a meeting once with a podcast with Bernard-Henri Lévy, who's very upset that America's kind of abdicated its role in the world. He wrote a whole book on it. And he said, America is becoming isolationist. And I said, you know what, Henri, not really. It's that we hate to lose. And this is the thing you have to understand about Americans. They hate to lose and they hate getting ripped off. And there is a real sense since Vietnam that we keep losing wars and we keep getting ripped off. And the idealism of a George Bush that wanted to go into Iraq and build democracy, Americans they lost the stomach for that kind of grand idealism. And then, Obama comes in and does the reverse, but he does it in a way that says America is not an exceptional country. So he goes too far in the other direction. not only am I not going to get involved and tell the world how to run their business, but I'm also going to remind everyone that we're not that great. So that pissed off the other half of the country. So when Trump came in, he did a combination of both Bush and Obama. So he had the withdrawal instincts of Obama, saying, "I'm not going to squander money and get ripped off and just try to do things that are impossible, that are not going to benefit America directly. At the same time, I'm going to have the pride of George Bush." He figured out the magic combination of those two, and people love that. So they're proud to be Americans, and they don't want to get ripped off. That was Trump. Now the Chinese situation fits perfectly into the Trump doctrine, because the COVID 19 has given the world evidence that China is a really tough, sneaky competitor with a lot of ambitious agendas. And when China was brought into world, the world's economy, at the time the thinking was they're going to moderate their politics, and they're going to become more westernized. That never happened. China is a communist country with a capitalist system, and it's a very lethal combination. And right now there is a sense of this great rivalry between America and China. And if Trump wins the election, you should see that as one of the big events of the century, which is a revival of the Cold War, like in the last century between America and the Soviet Union. The next century will be America against China. And if Trump wins, it's all out rivalry.
So you're aware that Trump has withdrawn from Guam. So
Mhm.
while he is talking the talk with China, is maybe not walking the walk, because if your signal is to withdraw from Guam, what are you telling the Chinese?
Well, you have to understand something about Trump. Trump is a player. He grew up in the jungles of Manhattan real estate, where you play games all the time and you bluff and you make moves and you're reckless. And then he spent 14 years as a reality television show where you're constantly playing games, and he thinks money all the time. So that's the thing about Trump. So he can get away from Guam 1 minute, but the other hand, he can do something that is just in the completely different direction. The one thing to keep in mind is money and trade. And what is he going to do about the manufacturing base that we've lost to China? That's the thing to keep an eye on. And I can tell you that he's getting influence now from Karl Rove. He hated Karl Rove, and apparently Karl has been spending a lot of time in the White House. Karl Rove is not a guy who wants to go to all out, you know, war with China. There's two schools of thought right now, Albert, that are trying to influence Trump. One side is, when we can cooperate with China, we should. And the other side, which is reflected by, Steve Bannon and the guy Gordon Chang that came on my podcast, that is really like all out competition. There are rivals, there are enemies. It's a zero sum game. They don't want anything good, right? We can't trust them, and really like the Cold War. So who's going to win the heart and mind of Trump? I think it's the second one that's going to go all out against China, because Trump takes things personally. He really believes now that China was behind, that China could have prevented the disaster of COVID 19, which is the biggest disaster of Trump's presidency by far. So there's a lot of bad feelings towards China in America right now. Even among the Democrats, they realize that they can't give out the message that they used to, that they need to get tough on China if they want to get those independent votes that they need to win in the battleground states. So China is the issue right now in terms of foreign policy. It's taken over. I mean, it used to be, Iran and the Middle East and then the EU, but right now it's China. It's
Well,
China.
China just swallowed Hong Kong. Um, any news about that in the United States?
Well, he's under pressure to go against it, but the unfortunate reality is that we've allowed China to have a lot of leverage over us. You know, and and I think Trump is probably like buying some time, because if you are manufacturing 90% of a country's medication, including the antibiotics, right? That's a lot of leverage that you have. And I think this is the stuff you don't see in the news, is the realization that they have a lot of leverage over us. That's not the kind of thing Trump will ever admit, but he knows he's a negotiator, he's a player, he's a fighter, he's a warrior. He knows all about leverage, and they have leverage over us. And I think that's a race against time right now. And there is definitely a movement afoot to bring back a lot of manufacturing to America, which some of my friends who are economists are saying that this is a silver lining of COVID 19, that America manufacturing will rebound, the manufacturing that we allowed to go to China, and globalism is going to take a hit.
Well,
Like
if you want, from an economic point of view, I can tell you that in the 70s, when the United States revived China and starting using China as a manufacturer base, the agenda was to take advantage of the very cheap labor of China. And it is the same agenda going on until today, because that's what enabled the Western countries to curb their inflation. That they curbed their inflation with the very cheap labor coming out of China. So it is laughable when I hear the same countries today to say, are we going to bring back the manufacturing? Sure. I mean, in Australia,
and
for instance, we've got super strong unions. They are currently, even in the post-COVID-19, I believe we are post-COVID-19 now. Many will argue that we're not. But they're arguing about wages and about working conditions and so on. There is absolutely no chance in hell that our countries will become manufacturers again, because we simply can't afford it, and people will not buy things at twice or three times the price. So the reality is that China is there. And if it's not going to be China, it's going to be India, it's going to be other countries that will cause all sorts of problems. We've got in our civilization, Western civilization, fundamental issues that unless we look at them and fix them, there is no way that we're going to be able to bring back manufacturing here or there, by the way, David.
Well, what's interesting is the honesty that I've seen in the debate, and the people who talk about bringing back manufacturing in America. They're honest. They're saying it's going to mean, higher prices. I think there's a sense that America got drunk, and now they're in Alcoholics Anonymous, and they're in kind of a detox. We got drunk on globalism and low prices. We got so obsessed with these capitalist values that we realized we went so far. Can you imagine? We wake up one day and we said, we're so obsessed with low prices that this enemy country is now producing 90% of our medication, right? This was kind of the tipping point. And although I agree with you that it's very difficult to bring back a manufacturing base when you're so used to not having it, and you're so used to that low prices that you love at Walmart and Costco, I think we're heading in that direction right now. We're heading in that direction. And you're right that we will look at alternate countries like India, where you can still get cheap labor, but you're also going to see a major effort, especially if Trump wins in November, major effort to bring back manufacturing to America.
Well, that would be something that will look with great interest. So what about, you can't forget Iran, but you should not, because there is always if you forget that there is possibilities of having cancers that are completely working under the surface. And with Iran and terrorism, that's what's happening. So has the Middle East been totally forgotten?
What a question. It, it, we live in such a crazy world where, last year Iran was the big threat. And And now here we are, COVID 19, the right, and then another movement called accelerationist, which is way to the right of the alt right. And it's a fascinating movement. If you look on Vox, vox.com, you'll see it's like a homegrown American terrorist movement of far right Nazi neo Nazis, right? And it's real stuff. And they've created, you know, most of the terrorism has come from them in the past year and a half. And it used to come mostly from Islamic terrorists, right? So all of a sudden, Islamic terrorists, remember the days of ISIS and so forth, it's not top of mind anymore. However, Iran is still a major enemy, and this is where November is going to make a big difference. If Trump wins, Iran stays an enemy. If Trump does not win, then you will see the unraveling, bringing back the Iran deal and bringing back that kind of naive approach to the Middle East policy. If there's one good thing about Trump, he knows evil when he sees it. And his kind of bluntness and crudeness actually works perfectly in the Middle East. Um, and it's been effective. It's helped the rapprochement between the Gulf states and Israel. Iran has never been more vulnerable. Their economy is in tatters, and regime change is the only hope for that country. They're still the number one sponsor of terrorism in the world. They're getting really weak now in Syria because they overextended themselves. So if you ask me, Trump is winning in the Middle East.
But
And
Iranian still, their dream is obviously the pursuit of the atomic bomb, and they're not very far from obtaining it, and that's the real danger.
the people who are keeping a very close eye on it is Israel. Uh, Iran right now is very into cyber attacks, and you would know as much as anybody about Israeli security right now and you know how seriously they take the cyber attacks from Iran because it costs them a lot less money than to build these missiles. I'm not that worried about the Iran nuclear program because I really don't think that was their game plan all along. I think their game plan was domination of the region to bring back the hegemony of the Persian Empire way back. There are three great ethnic groups in the Middle East. You have the Persian group, you have the Arab group, and then you have the Turkish group. And they each took turns dominating the region. It used to be the great Persian Empire, and then you had the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turks, and for the past 100 some years, it was the Arabs who took over. And that battle is going to happen no matter what. So right now you have a combination of the Sunnis with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia against the Shiite with Iran, and Trump has come in squarely on the side of the Sunnis who are on the side of Israel, and it's kind of a little bit of a balance of power. And Israel's never been in a better position because the countries there realize that they need Israel's help to defend against Iran. So you got a real messy situation over there that is a kind of a certain equilibrium. But the most important thing to remember is that Iran is getting weaker and weaker. Their support among the population is eroding. Their economy is in tatters. Um, and they're completely overextending themselves in Syria, and so did Russia, by the way. So if you ask me, they're in trouble. Of course, you'll never know that because unlike America or Israel, there is no free press in these countries. That's the thing you have to remember. But I think if Trump wins in November, we will have a chance at regime change in Iran.
So in America, your journal, the Jewish Journal, obviously is distributed mostly to the Jewish community. The Jewish community would obviously have a lot to thank Trump for his stand with Israel, having moved the embassy to Jerusalem and so on. Yet that's not the case. I believe that the majority of American Jewry are against Trump. So what is the mindset? How do you understand that disconnect between positive action to Israel and the reaction of the Jewish community? Because that could be a lesson for other countries that may not be that positive for Israel. That is.
Yeah, well, there's a question of priorities. The great majority of Jews in America um, are extremely loyal to the Democratic Party. And for many of them, that comes first. And the policies of abortion, the economy, immigration, that is more important to them than Israel. For many of them, for many Jews, and they have it's like a le dor vador. It's like a heirloom that you pass on from generation to generation. We vote Democrats from the days of FDR, um, and and there's a real deep loyalty to the Democratic Party that transcends everything. I know Democratic friends of mine who are really pro-Israel, and they would have loved had Obama moved the embassy to Jerusalem. They would have celebrated all night, but the fact that it was Trump, they weren't so sure. So really, it's a really complicated situation with the Jews in America. I think it's pretty clear that Trump has been the best president for the Jews in America. When I get into debates with my friends in the Democratic Party, and I had like the head of the Jewish Democratic Council of America on my podcast, my favorite argument with them, Albert, is when I tell them, I listen to the voters in Israel because for me, they're the ones that are risking their lives and they're sending their kids to war and so forth. And if 80% of them think Trump is really, really good for Israel, then I'm not going to ignore that point of view. It's the strongest argument for Trump being good for Israel. And they have very little answer for that.
Yes, David, tell us a little bit about your pandemic podcast.
Well, I think it was my need to say something. All of a sudden, I'm stuck at home. I'm used to having a high adrenaline life where I have, power breakfast in the morning and I got galas and fundraisers almost every night and meetings all day long in my office. And all of a sudden, overnight, all the offices in America, virtually all of them, and all the stores closed. Overnight, everybody's stuck at home. Unbelievable, Albert. Unbelievable. All the parties, all the organizations, everything stopped. So I said to my daughter, who's my producer, I said, I got to talk about this. And we're used to doing like one podcast a week. And I plan it way ahead of time. And then we have a guest. And, it's really like we really, we take our time with podcast. And for the past couple of years, I've done one a week, right? So all of a sudden I said, Chani, I got to talk. What am I going to do? So I started on a whim. And I think it was this morning was episode 49. So every morning I get up, Albert, and I start my podcast. And in the beginning, I said, I have no idea where this is going to go. This is like, come along for the ride. This is my journey. Every morning, I'm going to share my thoughts. And it's been something I do now for myself as much as for anybody. So I just do it. And it's been a combination of I do interviews, I share my reflections, I read poetry, I speak to my neighbors, just a combination. On Friday, my daughter interviewed me in honor of my Hebrew birthday. So we have fun with it, but at the same time, I call it darkness and light, and this has been kind of the running theme of the podcast is I can't just stick with the darkness and I can't just stick with the light and the silver linings. There's a dance between darkness and light. And this is a horrible thing that's happened that's created incredible devastation, over 100,000 people dying and over 40 million people losing their livelihoods. And at the same time, I've never seen such a uh, sense of humanity and millions of people volunteering to try to help any way they can. And that's been kind of the silver lining that I try to include in every podcast is we cannot live just with despair. Human beings need hope. Hope is an oxygen for us. And I try to bring some of that hope despite all the darkness.
I highly recommend it. It's something light to start every morning, and people can find it wherever you normally find your podcast. But David, going from a confinement to a curfew, that's a big ask. That's a big task. I've never thought we'd seen this in the United States.
Yeah, it's if you have the right attitude in life, I think you try to gain from whatever life sends you. So all of a sudden, I find myself with hundreds of hours that I never had before. All these hundreds of hours, Albert, that I would normally be schlepping through town and going to meetings and going to fundraisers and so forth and going to my office. All of a sudden, these hundreds of hours just fall into my lap. So I'm in my house and I take my walks every day. And then I realized that, I'm a thinker. Thinking is kind of my hobby. So these hundreds of free hours that were dumped on into my lap, I've used them to think a lot. And you've been in my home, and you see I have a really nice deck, in my off my bedroom, and I've been doing so much thinking, and I think it's helped me write. I've written more, and I've gotten deeper. The thoughts that I've had have been different. The things I've talked about have been different. I've shared a lot of deep stuff on the podcast, and I try to gain something from the devastation that I've seen, and I've also tried to be honest and not try to live in denial, because a lot of people do that. They pretend, they just completely ignore the darkness. I can't do that. So it's been quite a journey, Albert. I mean, and I tell my kids, this is a moment in history. You're going to tell your grandchildren about this moment, and it's probably never going to happen again, that you have this moment when you're literally stuck at home month after month. In the beginning, when they made this big announcement that they were going to extend the lockdown until May 15th. And we're all freaked out. May 15th? Are you kidding me? And now look, we're in June and they're talking about July, and now there's riots. It's crazy.
Do you believe that
Crazy.
President Trump handled the pandemic well? I mean, he's been criticized a lot in the United States, but what is
Well,
the take on it?
well, from the first day in the end of January that the pandemic came to America, and we squandered 6 weeks. If you go on the dispatch, and I can send you the link, there is a timeline that chronicles the disastrous performance of the Federal Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control, the Health Department, and they literally squandered 6 weeks when they could have nipped this thing in the bud. And wasting time on what kind of testing methods and so forth. It's really, I'll send it to you, Albert, and you can share it with your readers. Now you can say, is that Trump's responsibility? Ultimately, yes, but he was really badly served by the bureaucracy beneath him. Now, of course, the move of blocking the flights from China was kind of a smart move, but Trump was not the right guy for this war, Albert. It's not his kind of war. He fights men. He fights men in boardrooms and Congress and offices and TV sets. He fights people. He doesn't fight a virus that he can't see. Everything about this was anti-Trump. He spent 75 years of his life just having one kind of battle. I use the expression that it's like you are an incredible country and Western dancer and you're the world champion. All of a sudden, one night, you find yourself in a disco competition. The music is different, the dance is completely different, and the costumes are completely different. And you're expected to perform. He couldn't. This was not his kind of war, and it showed. And you can see him flailing away. I mean, it was not a disaster, but you can tell this was not Trump's kind of war. And we did suffer a price for it. And who knows if we can put the puzzle back together. Because what people forget is that a lockdown is, imagine you have this puzzle that you and your family have been working on for a whole year on this big dining room in your house, and then some kid comes in 5 seconds. He completely destroys the puzzle and he loses a third of the pieces. This is what a lockdown is. Good luck putting the puzzle back together. It's really easy to do the lockdown. And now we're really realizing, I called it this oh my God moment. It's not that easy to reopen the economy. A lot of my friends won't go to a restaurant even if they reopen it.
David, it's the same in Australia.
Yeah.
When our prime minister called for a lockdown, I don't think he realized that he transferred his powers to the states, because now it's up to the states to reopen, and not everyone is playing the game. We've got
Right,
we
and and you have a restaurant, Albert. I mean, you know the game. You know the
have
margins are really low.
restaurants,
Margins are super low.
hotels,
You
and we are totally. We've been our businesses have been totally destroyed, and to reopen, it's not going to be that easy.
right?
But for the entire economy, it's not going to be easy. I mean, those who thinks that we are going to rebound, but we have a premier here in Victoria who just announced on Friday that if we reopen, that is our head offices and so on, we would be fined $100,000. Now, we were all geared up to go back to work on the 1st of June, and sadly this happens, and we are in again working from home for another month. The difference between Australia and the United States, of course, is in Australia we hardly have any cases. There is absolutely no medical reason for us to be confined. There is no medical science behind those decisions. Really, I can't wait until all this thing is over for people to start thinking again, because we're going to have serious debates about the abuse of power of our states, and certainly even the initial decision of our prime minister and the current government is going to have to be examined very closely, but also the lack of response of the opposition. I mean, the oppositions, they all went to sleep. So it's extraordinary how everyone has been able to take all the good values of what makes our Western societies and throw them out of the window simply because they panicked and they had absolutely no response. And the best response was, let's destroy everything. That's what they've done, but they are unwilling to compensate our businesses, and they are only continuing to ask us to do nothing. It's unbelievable. I am
we
here, and I think that I have to pinch myself to believe what is happening.
Well, you
Um,
know, Albert,
yeah.
before the riots, this was the big debate in America. Only a week ago, this was the big debate. I published a piece by Dennis Prager called the global lockdown may be the greatest mistake in human history. And it created a big stir. And you were seeing now in the New York Times, all over the country, did we go too far? This was the big debate in America that's been interrupted by the riots. But that debate is not going away. And with time, people are realizing that we may have gone too far. And just to close on this point, because I mentioned earlier the partisanship and the polarization that's so entrenched, unfortunately, there is a real school of thought that says that the Democratic Party has an interest in continuing the lockdown because the worse the economy is, the worse it is for Trump. And this is where credibility comes in, the issue of media credibility. And that's what makes this debate, this conflict, and this conversation so corrosive, is because nobody trusts the other side. And there's a real concern among people who want to reopen the economy that the Democrats do not want to reopen it for purely political reasons.
So let's find a positive note to end this webinar. I let you the choice.
Oh, you kidding? Easy choice. Uh, First of all, I remind all my listeners that life is absolutely beautiful. I look at nature every day. I look at the beautiful trees and the birds and the flowers. I listen to incredible music that no matter what happens in the world, there is a incredible amount of beauty in life, in art, and in culture. And then on top of that, we have the little pleasures and the little uh, beauties of our own little lives. Like for me, I became a grandfather, so I get to see my beautiful son on Zoom all the time. And as much as there's been devastation, there's also been an incredible outpouring of humanity, and new babies are born, and people are still getting married, and friendships are being deepened. I go out of my way now to connect with my friends. I think you and I have gotten closer, during this create the fact that I can't be together with friends physically, makes me want to connect with them even more socially. I speak to my mother instead of once a day, 2 or 3 times a day now. So I have seen that if you have the right attitude, then you can really make a great big full life no matter what.
So, David, where can people find you?
Aha, jewishjournal.com. We have a brand new website. So we like to think of ourselves as the pulse of Jewish America, and Jews are very curious and engaged people. They're engaged with all aspects of society. I'm David Suissa JJ. That's my handle on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But my big love of my life professionally is jewishjournal.com, and you can see we like to cover the whole buffet, whether it's poetry, culture, politics, philosophy, local news, New York news. It's just a whole beautiful buffet of life, Judaism, and everything that our readers care about.
David, it was lovely talking to you. Thanks for taking the time. And I will give you a call very shortly after this.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's great to be here. I have fond memories of the time I spent with the dialogue in Israel a few times, and you have some really sharp listeners.
Thank you, David. Talk to you soon.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
Bye, everyone.